Desire turning to my mind. I open up my heavy eyes. We go into the bed. I'm ready. Fall into the feeling. Give it up, my love. Let your world unravel. Get your heart unfurled. My heart uncable. As these moments come, hard of feeling. Is my soul undone? You're still beating. Desire turning to my mind. I open up my heavy eyes. We go into the bed. I'm ready. Fall into the feeling. Give it up, my love. Let your world unravel. Get your heart unfurled. Let my heart uncable. Under main of night, I remember when I held you tight. We surrendered. Desire turning to my mind. I open up my heavy eyes. We go into the bed. I'm ready. Fall into the feeling. Give it up, my love. Let your world unravel. Get your heart unfurled. Let my heart uncable. Give it up, turn to my mind. Let your world unravel. Heavy eyes. Get your heart into the bed. I'm ready. My heart into the feeling.
You're a rich girl and you're gone too far, 'cause you know it don't matter anyway. You can rely on the old man's money. You can rely on the old man's money. It's a bitch girl, but it's gone too far, 'cause you know it don't matter anyway.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another NYU Los Angeles Discovery Session. It is my extreme pleasure this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, to welcome John Boyle. John. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Nina.
Nice to see you.
Very nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. So when we first met, and this really struck me, you told me that you were living in Japan, in Tokyo, with your son, as I recall, working for Live Nation Japan when the pandemic hit. And you have a very different life now than from when that happened a year ago. So can we just like start, because I'm a thriller writer, I want to go right into the drama. Can we start with what that was like, what you were doing in Japan, and how you got the word to come on home, and how that all went down?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of a funny story because, in America, the pandemic word first got out about the pandemic from the cruise ship that was parked outside of Tokyo Bay in Yokohama. And that was in, I think, early January, if I'm not mistaken. And we were living there. My son was a freshman in high school going to the American school in Japan. And it was like big news, like every single day in Japan, in Tokyo, on the local news, people are freaking out. Japan is a mask wearing culture to begin with. And so, you know, they don't have as big a problem with the flu, but there is mass paranoia when it comes to disease. So this was becoming a big deal. I had become friends with our ambassador and the folks at the embassy. While all their kids, the ambassador's kids as well, were going to the American School of Japan, and I'd become friends with our headmaster, and we all started talking amongst ourselves about, you know, is this really gonna happen? Like, is this craziness? Is this gonna be a global pandemic? And as they were getting more information, certainly more than I was, running Live Nation Japan, they started getting quite spooked. And, you know, we were all talking amongst ourselves, and it became clear that this was going to be bad. And really in the West hadn't quite caught on yet. So, you know, we started asking questions like, okay, what are we going to do with the school year? What about all the expats that are living in Japan? Are people going to go back to their home country? What's going to happen here? And things just kind of progressively got worse. I remember I came back to Los Angeles for the Polestar conference, and I was speaking on a panel, and somebody asked me on the panel, you know, what do you make of this disease? And at the time, and I really did believe this is the first week of February, I said, you know, I think it's going to blow over. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. You know, we're dealing with it in Japan. It hasn't really gotten, you know, overseas yet. And I really did believe that. Boy, was I wrong, clearly. And very quickly, it became clear that this was going to be a global pandemic. And really within a matter of days, I was talking with the embassy, and they said, we're sending a lot of our people home. We suggest you and your son go home now. And I was speaking with the headmaster, and he said, you know, we don't know what we're going to do yet, but you should probably go home now. A day or two later, the headmaster announced that they were going to go to distance learning. I think it might have been the first school on the planet. That went to
Not
distance
the last.
certainly not the last. And I thought that was a very smart move on their part. My son and I literally got on a plane, I think on March 2nd. You know, it was interesting because of the time change. Japan's 15 or 16 hours ahead, depending on daylight savings. My son could do distance learning from Los Angeles with the time change. He would just be in class at night, and
Right.
school would be taking place the next morning in Tokyo. So, you know, we came back, I think it was March 2nd, March 3rd. And literally a day or two later, all the borders were shut down and we were locked out. And so that was the story. And it was like, you could tell there
Yeah.
was fear at the airport. Like getting on that plane coming home, you could sense that people and the airline employees, like people were scared. And in
And
hindsight,
go, right? I mean, it turns out. And you're that's not your only child, right? You're married and you have a daughter as well, is that correct? Or
yeah, correct. I have an 18-year-old daughter who's currently a senior in high school, and she's going through the college acceptance process. We completed the college admissions process.
For all of you.
Now we're going through the acceptance process, and that logo behind your right shoulder is her number one choice. So,
All right, we will say a prayer. I have nothing to do with admissions, but I'll put some good energy out for you. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit because, you know, when we first met and you talked about, you know, how you and your wife decided that you would take one kid to Japan for the year, and obviously your career is involved an enormous amount of travel. And, you know, women get asked all the time, how do you manage to do it all? How do you find work-life balance? And, you know, and men just don't get asked it. And I decided that I was changing that. So, you know, you're my first victim, but like, I think it's important to ask men. And I know from chatting before we went live that, you know, you're kind of enjoying your new role a little bit, being home, right? And not being on a plane all the time or being away all the time. So can you just talk a little bit about that, how you and your family have worked that out with your careers?
Sure. I mean, I have spent a lot of my career on planes. You know, it started out traveling domestically, and over the past 15 years, it's literally been around the entire world. You know, working at Insomniac, I had the privilege of opening up Electric Daisy Carnival festivals in Brazil, Mexico, England, India, China, Korea, Japan. It's kind
I've
of
been to it in Japan.
how
I did.
amazing. Um, and then while in Japan, which was for the better part of 3 years, I was commuting, and when I say commuting, I mean I was spending 3 weeks a month in Tokyo and 1 week a month in Los Angeles. When you have a 10-hour flight, a 12-hour flight there, and a 10-hour flight back, and that 16-15-hour time change, you never really get on a set schedule, and
Right.
it's really hard. Um, but work-life balance. I mean, I feel very fortunate and blessed that I've had the career that I've had, and it's everything I ever wanted. I'm a blue-collar kid from Tahoe. I kind of fell into the music business, and I did have a very very much a focus on traveling and international, because I spent my sophomore year, my college year of, I'm sorry, my junior year of high school in Italy as an
Yeah.
exchange student. You brought up my daughter. My daughter spent her sophomore year of high school in Paris. And then, of course, my son spent his freshman year of high school in Tokyo. When I met my wife was very career driven as well. Um, and she's had a wildly successful career as a fashion executive.
Mm.
And we had to figure out early on how we share that role of being parents and being supportive spouses. And it was never a case of, I brought home the bacon and, you are in the kitchen. On the contrary, my wife, she's been fortunate to get a lot of stock options, and she's done incredibly well. So she kind of brings home the bacon, and lately I've been spending the time in the kitchen. So I think it comes down to commitment to the family first and foremost. I used to plan my trips back from Japan based on when my daughter was cheerleading at a football or basketball game, or when my wife had to go to New York, because my wife pre-pandemic would have to go to New York usually once a month, once every other month for work. She's a buyer for a big retailer, a New York-based retailer, so she'd have to go back a lot, and we just would have to work it out. So it was never a male-female thing for us. It was a balancing act of how do we maximize our career opportunities and be good parents and be good to each other. And it hasn't been easy.
I think there are a lot of women in the audience who would like to clone you right now.
Well, I mean, listen, it took years and years for us and for me, to learn to adapt. And when you're a young man, you don't have the sensitivity, the wisdom that you do when you get older. I really value my wife's career. And thank God she's had more job stability than I have over the years. Mine's been a roller coaster ride with really high highs and then periods. She's just been consistent growth and.
Well, I say that most of us who pursue careers in the arts have more of a roller coaster than a straight trajectory. I mean, I think that's more common than not. Even the most successful people, have failures, and it's just when you're creating events or product that is about the accolades of the masses, you swing, sometimes you hit, sometimes you miss, right? I mean,
yeah, and I think we're both proud of the job we've done as parents.
Mhm.
I think we're just lucky that we have good kids, and we have scheduling meetings. It sounds silly, but we sit down and we have scheduling meetings. My wife and I do together. We do as a family, and we divide and conquer. And that's the only way I think we can do it when you aren't, when you're not, when you don't have a staff of helpers around you and things like that. If you're trying to maintain normalcy in, West Los Angeles, uh, these are things that you have to do, right?
Relative thing, normalcy in West Los Angeles, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. I
Right.
want to go back because I know you talked about your blue collar roots in Lake Tahoe and how you sort of fell into the music business. So I'd like to use that opportunity to talk about how you got your start, because a lot of our audience is students, not all, but and I know that like that's always the big question. How did you break in? So what was your path? And I know no path is the same, and that's why it's always so interesting to hear the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Lake Tahoe. My mom was a school teacher, and my dad was a steel contractor. And I grew up, they were kind of hippies, and I grew up on rock and roll, and always had an instrument in my hands. Started out with flute, which didn't last very long, and moved to piano, and then ultimately settled on drums. And but I was also student body president. I was always really into doing things and putting things on, producing, a talent show or the rallies or what have you. And there was no plan. The plan was go to the best college that I could possibly get into. And I had my heart set on Stanford or Berkeley, being from NorCal. I didn't get into either school, so I can relate with my daughter as she's getting some denials from some schools.
Yeah.
I ended up at UCLA, which did just deny my daughter. So we're no longer Bruin fans, except in the Sweet 16 right now. But that's a different conversation. But so I ended up at UCLA and found some guys that were playing instruments and kind of started a band and joined a fraternity. And next thing you know, we were putting on parties and the band was playing, and then I was booking shows on campus and then booking my band at other fraternity parties and then at other schools. And it just kind of those were the humble beginnings. I didn't even realize this was a business. It just like, we were just having fun and playing music and partying, and that was kind of it. I was fortunate to be at UCLA in the late 80s, graduating in the early 90s. And there was a convergence at that time of action sports and music, kind of the first convergence of it. Action sports representing the surf, skate, snow culture. I had been a competitive ski racer in high school up in Tahoe. And so I kind of came from that culture. And Los Angeles was the epicenter of this. Actually, Orange County was the epicenter of it. And my band and my promoting and producing kind of found ourselves right at the beginning of this entire thing. And next thing you know, ESPN launches the X Games. I find myself booking that. There's a trade show called Action Sports Retailer. I'm booking that.
And you're booking them to do what? To produce the event?
Not to produce like the competition or the trade show, but all these things had elements of music built into them.
I see.
So at the first X Games in Providence, Rhode Island, they had a stage. It was a little teeny weeny stage, but I booked a bunch of bands, many of whom became big bands, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, and who were nothing at the time. And it was super fun. And I was flying around the country just doing these action sports events. We'd bring a flatbed truck onto the bottom of the snowboard park at Mammoth Mountain, and we put a band on it. We put some unknown band named Incubus on it, and then 20 years later they're massive. 10 years later they're massive. And so back in those days, the goal for any young person in the music business was to get the record label job. This was the panacea, if you will. Like, you had to get the label job. And I was just out there kind of hustling. And one day I got a call from a guy named Irving Azoff, that if anybody is studying the music business or knows the music business, he should have his own book, not his own chapter.
Probably does have one in the works, I would guess, but yeah.
Well, he should. He called me up. He said, I'm not quite sure what you do, but whatever you do, will you come do it for me at my record company? He had a record company called Giant Records. And he said, and you can do your side, you can do everything you want, as a side hustle. He's like, I'll just pay you, come and do this for me. I think I was 26. You know, he gave me a good salary for a 26-year-old, and I thought I had just hit the jackpot.
Right.
And simultaneous to this, very interestingly, is a guy named Kevin Lyman, who was with Golden Voice at the time. Golden Voice is the producer of Coachella. I'm part of AEG. Kevin Lyman launches the Warped Tour. And Kevin was my friend, and he asked me if I would do sponsorship and marketing for the Warped Tour, which was a traveling skateboard-themed multi-stage music festival. So I'm like loving life. I've got my side hustle going. I'm a marketing director for Irving. I'm marketing guy for Warped Tour. That goes on for 2 years. I leave Warped Tour and start my own tour, a tour that we called Snowcore. I actually started it with a guy named Rick Bondi, who was a booking agent, and Bradley Knowles from Sublime. I ended up owning that tour for 11 years.
Wow.
And we broke Incubus and System of a Down and a long list of bands that toured on my tour. Again, doing this simultaneous to working at record companies. I spent 2 years with Irving at Giant. I then went to Virgin Records for 2 years, where I became a senior director of marketing. I then followed my boss from Virgin Records, Phil Quartararo, a New Yorker, from Virgin to Warner Brothers, where I became a vice president. I had my own label, spent about 2 or 3 years there. Wanted to sign another band. His boss wouldn't let me. That band was a little band called Alien Ant Farm, which I became their manager, signed them to the second band signed to DreamWorks Records, which was Spielberg, Katzenberg, Geffen at the time. That first album, they had a cover of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal, which became the #1 rock song in the world in 2001. And that album sold 2 million units. Ended up spending about 8 years in management, 10 years in management. Joined a company called Sanctuary, did day-to-day on Jane's Addiction and Hole, and some wonderful yet crazy bands. They seem to give me all the challenging ones.
Okay. All right. So talk about that. You've just opened the door. I'm going to walk right in. Who are some of the more challenging bands to talk about? Can we dish, or are you going to zip tight and keep it quiet?
Well, I mean, what I will talk about. I mean, listen, those rock bands that are kind of notorious for their habits. Most of those folks were very, very nice people. They had some problems, I spent years as a manager in gangster rap and hip hop, and that could get very challenging. Not necessarily because the artists themselves were bad people. On the contrary, the people I worked with, I found to be good people, but the environment and the surroundings was tough. Making videos wearing bulletproof vest was something I hadn't really done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Having to check into airports 2 hours before a flight so the security patrol could check their guns was something that I wasn't used to. Settling a show in a foreign country with a promoter and having the promoter put a gun on the table and having my head of security put a gun on the table and me kind of sitting there saying, okay, guys, are we going to settle this show? Or that was dicey stuff.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't know that my wife thought it was a lot of fun. I value the experience. It taught me a lot, honestly. And there's just a lot of that out there. By the way, there's a lot of that out there in all genres. There's just more of it in gang. I mean, there's just more of it in rap. It is what it is. Is
there one musician that you got to work for that was like your iconic, oh my God moment, like that you had like a fanboy thing over, that when you got to work with, it sounds like you broke a lot of new people, but did you work with anyone that you came into already a fan?
Well, I mean, You know, I mean, I've met a lot of my heroes.
Okay, who are your heroes that you got to meet?
You know, I mean, I got to meet Jimmy Page.
Oh, cool.
You know, I got to meet Paul McCartney. Um, you know, Ozzy. Um, and then, you know, I've been able to do a lot of you know, I got to do 2 sold out 30,000 seat arena shows with U2 in Tokyo. I mean,
Amazing, yeah.
uh,
I can't believe that I was at Electric Daisy Carnival in 17 in outside of Tokyo. I wish I knew you then, but that was we were happened to be traveling in Tokyo and Hong Kong, and I saw that an artist I like was playing in Hong Kong, and it was Fatboy Slim, but he was going to be gone by the time we were gone. And then I said, well, maybe he's playing in Tokyo, so we just looked up and on a whim bought tickets and went. It was fantastic.
did you see a set? He was on the beach, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Playing on the beach and
Yeah. Yeah, I love that venue. It was fantastic with the stadium and the beach and the whole thing. It was great.
yeah, it's a great venue, except there's a 10 p.m. curfew, which
Right.
is kind of anti-rave, if you
Right.
will. I
Yeah,
like that
but
better.
for a raver, so I appreciated an early curfew.
I used to tell Pasquale at Insomniac he'd want to do shows all night long
Yeah.
anywhere we'd go, and I'd say, dude, nothing good happens after 10 a.m. 2 p.m. 2 a.m.
Yeah,
Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. By the way,
maybe slide down. Okay.
really good. Nothing good happens after 10 a.m. That's for sure.
So it sounds like, so you talked about some of the things that were really challenging for you and rewarding. What was like the most out of the box thing you ever put together? Like the most like exotic or crazy, ambitious thing that you ever did?
Well, I mean, every EDC around the world was very challenging. China was particularly difficult. I mean, you didn't know if the show was going to happen an hour before the show. Permits didn't get issued until the same day. So, I mean, you would invest all this money in talent and travel and production, 2 or 3 days to build a festival site, and you're really not quite sure. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was the second EDC China, immigration raided the show, and like literally artists were jumping in vans and like everybody was trying to get away from immigration. Everybody had their visas. I mean, it was all by the book, but the authorities just decided they were going to clamp down.
Right. Right.
And people got on planes like the first plane out. So people were flying to like Vietnam or just anywhere to get like on the first plane out of town, so that the authority. So that was dicey.
Right.
EDC Brazil was very challenging. We had like a monsoon, whatever you call it in Portuguese, hit the festival site. We had a big inflatable backdrops, big owls, something like thing or owls, and like lightning struck one and it popped, and the entire site became mud. I'm not talking like mud like Woodstock mud. I'm talking like mud like up to your thigh mud.
Oh,
You couldn't get cars in and out. That was dicey as well. So, and we never did a show there, but maybe the most exotic place was we toured Croatia. Pasquale and I flew and toured Croatia, and we looked at a couple of different festival sites, and then we actually drove from the northern part of Croatia along the coastline all the way down to the southern part, and there's all these islands out there kind of in between.
I hear it's beautiful. I've never been, but I hear it's spectacular coastline.
It was the most spectacular coastline I'd ever seen. And there's one part where you go into, God, I forget what country it is, but you go into a communist country for like 5 miles. So you have to go through these 2 border crossings, and they take you out of the car, and it was a trip. We never did pull off a show there. There's a lot of corruption and other stuff that made it just too complicated to do.
So we've had a couple of questions from people, both of people who were emailing before and live now, about, how the event landscape has changed, in the last 10 years and now during the pandemic, obviously. I mean, and as a related question to this, so I just want to tie it in and then let you loose. Like, as I understand it, the advent of streaming changed the economic model of the business so that really touring and merch were the primary revenue streams for artists. And so I want to know, just, is that true? Because that's my outsider's perspective. And so what's your perspective on that? How has event landscape changed over the last 10 years? What's happening now? And where do you think it's going to go post-pandemic?
Right. So, I mean, I think streaming has actually brought some revenue back into the recorded music and publishing side of the revenue pie. There was a period before streaming really caught on, and CDs were basically out. Kind of the age of buying a download. People weren't really buying that many downloads, and artists really weren't getting paid. So at least now artists are getting paid a teeny weeny bit from streaming. There's all this data that's recently become available about how many artists are making a living from streaming, and I mean, look, at the end of the day, you're never going to get the economics back that an artist had from selling CDs. It's just not possible. I mean, when you have a product whose margin is 95% of, maybe even more, it's but the labels are back and they're making a lot of money. They're making a lot of it on catalog, right? So catalog streams very strong, and the deals with the artist, the artists just don't see a lot of it. Yes, most performing artists have made the majority of their revenue from touring and merchandise, and certainly that's been hit hard in the past year and a half. And I think we are seeing the business open up. I'm not sure how fast it's going to open up. We are optimistic it's going to open up fast. I don't know that we're going to see complete scale until 2022. Maybe we'll see fall. Most of the festivals have been canceled for this summer.
Just postponed to 22 entirely.
Yeah, but Outside Lands in San Francisco announced that they were moving from August to Halloween weekend. Life is Beautiful in Vegas is in September and just sold out. Reading and Leeds in the UK just sold out and sold an incredible amount of tickets. So that's showing that there's pent up demand out there.
Yeah, do you think are those concerts going to be run with social distancing protocols? I mean, obviously it'd probably be, location to location and subject to local authority, but what do you think? I mean, I'm a diehard Coachella attendee, and I'm usually down in the Sahara tent listening to the EDM Crushed by Humans, but I don't know that I'm so ready to go get crushed by humans myself right away. Like, I can contemplate maybe going to the Hollywood Bowl or the Greek, but what do you think? Do you think it's going to be like it was the festival scene?
I mean, I think that promoters and festival producers are planning on it being that way, albeit with some safety measures in place. If you're an independent promoter or festival producer, I think you can take greater risk, right? I think Live Nation and AEG are going to, I know they're going to be very cautious. And I respect that. I think they should be very cautious. I don't know how you can do sellout business and maintain social distancing. And this is a conversation not just about festivals, but about concerts in general, right? So in certain places of the world, even here in the States, venues have been open up at, 10% capacity. The economics don't work
right
at 10% capacity. So, artists may do it and people may do it just to kind of get things going again. And I think there's an element of building trust out there, showing it can be done, making people feel comfortable about coming back to shows. And you know, it's the data is very interesting because depending on who the artist is, depending on what the festival is, depending on what the demographic is, you're either going to see, like, I think just, you know, people come in droves with a much greater disregard for safety than, say, a baby boomer concert.
Right. Right.
You know,
So at the beginning of the pandemic, the baby boomers were the most reckless. I don't know if you followed that, but there was a whole campaign of, you know, 20 and 30 somethings begging their parents to take it seriously because they were all like, you know, 50 is the new 20 and I'm invincible. But anyway, that's a digression. I do think it'll be different. So this, it relates to another question I have, which is, what is the conversation with regards to festivals and touring with respect to sustainability? And do you think that sort of and I know there's been some conversation within in the industry about it. And do you think that also the pandemic has changed thinking about how to approach more sustainable touring?
well, I think the pandemic's allowed everybody to have more time to explore, and you know, really explore, because you're not buried with your head down, just, you know, banging out one show after another show and
Right.
getting through the day and just, you know, trying to keep up like we all do in any job, right?
Mhm.
So there's been a bit, but I can tell you, you know, certainly Live Nation and AEG, these guys really do care big time. So you know, the moves, and I can speak more to Live Nation than I can to AEG because I've been underneath the Live Nation umbrella for almost 10 years now. You know, the company really cares, and so you'll find that you know, there's a lot less plastic. You know, Pasquale, for example, he hates selling water bottles at Insomniac show, plastic water bottles. Instead, and he's a brilliant marketer. He sells, you know, like permanent water bottles, and then he offers free water,
Right.
right? So everybody walks around with their water bottle, and also then you keep everybody hydrated.
Right. Exactly. Healthy branding. It works for everyone.
It
Yeah.
works for everybody, right? You know, I know at the Live Nation amphitheaters, they started selling Impossible burgers
Right.
recently. So
They're delicious. I'm down for them. I appreciate them.
you know, so I think the promoters, especially the big guys, really care.
Mhm.
And not to say the indies don't. Everybody cares. I just think the big guys have more resources.
Mhm.
And you know, I mean, they have entire staffs dedicated to.
I also think what you said earlier is very true, that the pandemic gave many places a time to take a breath and say, okay, what can we learn from this? What can we do differently? I mean, you know, and I think obviously the very nature of live events means that I mean, maybe you can utilize technology differently, you know, but I think everyone who's smart said, okay, how can I move forward a little differently? How can I take advantage of this pause to
Yeah.
figure out how to do things better?
Definitely that happened, and that happened in terms of a lot of the social movements. That happened in terms of a lot of the philanthropic
Mhm.
considerations.
Mhm.
It happened across the board,
Mhm.
and I do think that you know, most of the ecosystem has learned and will be better for it. And going into it, I think much of the ecosystem, especially with environmental, was very conscious about it. You know, I think some of the social movements have really been amplified during the pandemic, and we'll see a lot of improvement with those moving forward. You know, as far as the environmental efforts, a big challenge is the artist side. So, you know, you can be a promoter, you can be an event producer, you can own venues, and you have a footprint, right? And you decide what you buy to pour your beer in. You decide how you dispose of your waste. You get to make those decisions, right? You
Mhm.
don't decide how the artist tours, what trucks they use,
Mhm.
what generators they, you know,
Mhm.
there's a whole touring energy package algorithm, if you will, that,
Mhm.
that's really hard to solve.
Right. It's
Uh,
interesting because really the like an industry-wide solution actually requires looking at and approaching the industry from multiple perspectives and initiatives, right?
it's you know, the economics is always going to come into play
Of
in this.
course, yeah.
There's only so many 16-wheel big rig trucks to carry gear in. There's only so many tour buses, and then you start talking about international. Bill Gates was recently getting a hard time, who's the most philanthropic guy in the world,
Right.
right? And environmentally sensitive guy in the world. And that's his primary soapbox at this point, right? And
Mhm.
he was being given a hard time for, flying in planes.
Right.
Like some of these problems,
Right.
maybe they're not solvable, or they're
Right.
certainly not solvable in the short run. But can you power up your amps with solar? Absolutely, you can. And is there a lot of, maybe not entirely, but you
Right.
can. There's a lot of things that promoters and producers are doing, and then there's a lot of things that we're going to have to wait for technology to catch up.
Mhm. We have a question from Megan Ling, which I'm actually going to adjust a little bit because she said, how was the adjustment and cultural difference between working in LA and moving to Japan with Live Nation? But, I would say that sounds like you were living in Japan, but you've also traveled so much. And so I always think that international perspective is so great. But did you have to make major cultural differences when you moved to Japan or any other place that you lived in for an extended period of time? And how did you find that?
Well, actually living in Japan for an extended period of time, and running, an entire Japanese business unit, it was challenging, I'd go so far as to say that Japan is maybe more challenging than many other parts of the world. Um, you know, and no matter where you go, if you're putting on a show, you're building a festival, you do deal with a lot of the same issues. Politics,
Mhm.
permits, local ordinances, police. These are all things that you have to deal with no matter where you are.
Mhm.
Japan has a very, very unique business culture. And it's a very, very unique place. It's special in so many ways. It's pristine. You don't. Somebody asked me the other day. They're like, I went to Tokyo on vacation, and she's like, I couldn't find a garbage can to put my Starbucks cup in, because nobody litters. Like, uh, but at the same time, there's a real rigid business culture there. So it's hard to get things done.
Mhm.
And things move very, very slowly. And this is pretty well known about Japanese business culture. There's meetings upon meetings. You have a meeting about a meeting. You talk about one detail of a detail. Everybody has to go back and meet with their own people, and then they come back and they talk. Like the concept of sitting at a table and having a negotiation is
Mhm.
not one that happens very often. And there's a real resistance to perceived confrontation. A negotiation is perceived as confrontation.
Mhm.
For those of us in the West, like that's just how you get stuff done,
Right.
right? And then you can go to the complete opposite end of the pendulum, where you go to Brazil, and it's just like everything's on the table, and you scream and yell, and then at the end of the meeting you give each other a big hug, but you got a deal, right? And then you go to China, and China, it's like, you don't know if you're going to walk out of there with all your fingers after a meeting. So each country is very different, and living in Japan, it was culturally just very, very different. The food is wonderful. And everybody, again, it's very pristine and very proper, until it isn't. And then when it isn't, it's like mayhem and all hell breaks loose. Like, there's no such thing in Japan as like, oh, let's go have a couple of drinks. It's like, let's go from having a very, very stoic meeting to getting fall down drunk, and so you have to be very, very sensitive, wherever you go internationally. And I do think bringing the sensibilities back, as you kind of alluded to, Nina, like being sensitive to how, people think, around the world in their own way, or in a universal way, I think is something that is we can learn from in America. We can definitely learn from in America. Um, and it's I feel very fortunate that I've had this experience. I think it's my favorite part of my skill set, that I have this understanding of of the world, if you will.
Why I love to travel and, also read, because that takes you into other perspectives. But this is actually a good question from the audience, or sort of related to this. With international events, how much of the vision and execution is driven by an American lens, and how much is the local culture considered?
Well, I mean, I can really speak to Pasquale's vision and Insomniac and Electric Daisy Carnival, and it was, Pasquale has a vision. There's a very, very strong vision, and and yet we're putting on massive raves that come with it, a connotation. But he's all about love, peace and love and safety and humanity, and and so when you go into a place that perceives that you're just doing a rave, and that maybe you aren't as concerned about the health and safety of the attendee, that's a delicate, a delicate thing to manage, and that's kind of how I go back to, like, every everywhere in the world, whether you're dealing with the city government, the federal government, the local police, the local medical facilities. It's all really different. I think, generally speaking, not just for Insomniac, but whether if it's a domestic brand, a domestic artist, you're trying to bring your lens of Lollapalooza. It was an American brand, right?
Right.
So you take it to Brazil, you take it to Sweden, and you adapt, but it's very much an American kind of experience. So I think most of the traveling brands come from America. Whereas a lot, Rock am Ring, Rock am Park in Germany, it's a German brand. They do it in Germany.
Do you
Every
think that music is getting more global due to streaming? Or do you think it's still more localized, and then American or British bands tend to travel? What do you think about that?
I think, sure, I think that music is getting more globalized, but I think it's been globalized for a while. I mean, since I've been active in the international music business since really the early 90s, the big acts, the big acts on the festival business and the festival circuits were predominantly English speaking. So they were, British or American, or they were German or Spanish or whatever, but they sang in English. And then you always had lots of acts that were kind of localized. Rammstein in Germany, although even they sing in English. Vasco Rossi in Italy, ex-Japan in Japan. So I think what I do think with streaming is that discovery is easier and broader as a result of streaming. So yes, I think that's going to result in more globalization, but I think there's been a thirst for international artists here in English speaking, in the English speaking West, since I can remember. And at the end of the day, there's just a lot more artists, and that could be a subject, an hour-long subject. That could be a class.
Its own thing altogether, yeah.
Is the democratization of making music, the
Mhm,
democratization of distributing music,
mhm.
and how do you actually get noticed?
It's
Uh,
it's very I talk about this all the time from the filmed content side because it's the same. The democratization of equipment and editing software, et cetera, has mean anyone can make a movie. Not that anyone should. Not everyone should, but anyone can make content. But then how do you get it discovered? How do you distribute it? How do you bring an audience? How do you get eyeballs or ears on what you're doing? I think that, that is the puzzle, and you hear of the wonder, the ones that break through because their song is picked up and used on a TikTok meme or something. So you hear about those, but I think it is a much larger, and maybe we'll have you back for another in-depth look into that because that is really interesting. But I want to move on because we do have other questions from the audience and I want to try to get through those. So this is from Jenna Barber, who we love. She's her third time with NYULA, so she's practically a lifer and a very excellent student. She wants to know your opinion on the survival of independent labels and venues. What do you think is going to happen there? Do you think everything's going to get centralized post-pandemic after the economic hit, or do you think they will survive?
well, it depends on the respective business model, and and they're very different. Independent labels, um, you know, generally speaking, don't participate in touring or merchandise. And so their business wasn't shut down. So if the independent labels are signing quality acts, if they're very good marketers, if their artists are very good marketers and writing good music and compelling, then I think those, I don't think indie labels are going away. On the contrary, you could make an argument that, there could be more and more indie labels and that artists are going to start their own labels.
Yeah, can you? I wanted to jump off of something you said about how well the artists market themselves, and I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit because I really do feel that that part of what we were talking about, that through that ability to break through requires that artists. I certainly look at this from my perspective as a novelist. You're required to do a lot of your own marketing, right? You're your own brand. You have to promote that. So can you talk a little bit from the music perspective what you think artists need to know about marketing themselves and their brand and not just relying on the support of their label or their touring company?
Well, I mean, listen, if any artist thinks that they can, write songs, record songs, and it's all going to come to them, they're just wildly wrong. I mean, the artist has to be the CEO or board of directors of their own career, probably with a manager. Um, Not just to go back for a second, Nina. When Napster first came out, and I'm sure you remember this. I don't know if too many
Barely.
students.
I was barely born then, so it's a faint memory. But yeah.
And then MySpace came out. Like, everything was do it yourself. That, this was now the golden opportunity for artists. They don't need the record company. They don't need a manager. They don't need anything. You can do it all yourself. And that's just straight up wrong because the supply has increased so dramatically. Again, it's about how do you get noticed and how do you build a fan base. So what I have argued, and there's always an example of somebody who did it themselves who will raise their hand and say, nope, I totally disagree. But the value of the team has become more important than ever to have a career. So, but you have to manage the team, So yes, you have to know what your brand is. You have to direct everybody on your team, or your manager does, and everybody has to come and and do their part. A label comes with marketing. They come with distribution. People say commercial radio doesn't matter anymore. I don't think we're there yet. I think it still matters. Certainly, online radio matters. TikToks of the world, radically changing the marketplace. The Pelotons of the world, are a new way for discovery. You know, how do you get on a playlist at Peloton? Well, that's what labels do now. You know,
Right.
they used to print your CDs, and they used to, you know, they used to get you on commercial radio, but now they get you on Pelotons. So, but again, none of this is going to happen if you aren't leading by example, and if you're not working hard. And your job is to work with your team, and to a certain degree, manage your team across the board. So, yes, I mean, again, you know, if you're going to write songs, then maybe you should be a songwriter and get yourself a publisher, and then you don't have to worry about, you know, you just hope your songs sell and
Right.
artists pick them up. So, you know, just really quick, if I may, you know, on the independent venue thing,
Yeah, of course.
you know, I think, you know, most independent venues and independent venue owners, this has been an excruciating time for them. And I think most care so much about their business and their role in the ecosystem, discovery, local marketplaces, things like this. You know, in most of America, tertiaries and small markets, even some secondary, like there aren't big venues. There's only small independent venues. And these cities, these towns would not get live music if it weren't for these venues. I think most of them, not all of them certainly, have figured out a way to just get by. There has been an initiative called Save Our Stages, that a big chunk of this latest, not a big chunk, but a decent chunk of this latest economic stimulus package is going to. Independent promoters are getting a piece of it. So I just think a lot of people have figured out how, like, kind of like anybody, like you either figure it out or you can't. And if you can't, it's not necessarily because you didn't try and you weren't smart enough. Maybe you just got dealt a bad hand and you couldn't get your way out of this, you know, like so many restaurants and bars and things like that. But I think the independent venue is going to come back stronger than ever. There was a lot of talk that there was going to be major consolidation among independent venues, and that and you asked, you know, you used the word centralized. There were some investing types that were talking about coming and buying up, and there's been a little bit of that action, and I think there'll continue to be some of that action. But I think generally speaking, if you're an important independent venue, you figured out a way to stay afloat, you took out some loans, maybe somebody with some money in your market chose to help you out, and you know, will the Troubadour here in Los Angeles ever go away? The answer to that is no.
I find that reassuring. I find that a reassuring answer, that the Troubadour will never go away. So this question comes from someone I believe you know, whose name is only identified as Fish, but Fish says, welcome home, John. Been a long time since UCLA Warped Tour days together. So I'm assuming you know who that is.
Yes,
Okay. My question, with so many venues closed and pent up demand so high, this kind of pings off what we were last talking about. When can we return to touring, and how do you see the industry being able to book all the artists ready to go? Feels like a free for all is coming with too many acts available for venues.
Fish is a friend of mine from college, from UCLA, who I haven't seen in a very long time, and he asked a very good question. And, you know, I think it's something that's going to be very, very interesting. You know, I think there's going to be so many artists waiting to tour, mainly in America and then also Europe, that there's going to maybe be too much supply, despite how much demand there will be. And you know, if you keep in mind, so most artists will make most of their touring money in America. You can lop in Canada as kind of part of that, and or Europe. Yeah. Now, the reason for that is because you get scales of economy because it's all landlocked. So you get your truck, no matter how big you are. You either get your private jets and your big rigs, or you get your van and your trailer. And you just route, right? You don't have to put stuff on boats. Asia is a whole different situation. South America is not a real touring market yet. Um, and when you do look at the economics and that most of the acts tend to be American, I think we're going to have a situation where, we could have 3, 4, 5, 6 big name concerts every night in Los Angeles.
Look at Muzz, a smile on my face, since live music is my happy place. So I'm
Well,
pretty excited about that.
my hope is that all those shows can do the business. A lot of this is going to come down, I think, to the economy, and and what the economy looks like. And we all know, and that's another conversation too. But we have two economies out there. We have the real world economy, and then we have
Right.
the wealth economy and the stock market economy. I don't know. What I will say is I think there's a real opportunity, and I've been having a lot of conversations about this with a lot of people. I think there's a real opportunity and this is kind of a theme of mine right now, in tertiary markets and smaller markets. Because
Expand upon that, please. What do you mean by that?
because these markets, and even some secondaries, these markets tend to get overlooked in touring cycles. So you can have, it could be a big college town, Bloomington, Indiana, or, Chattanooga, or, I think there's a big, untapped market here where these audiences just haven't been well served. And it's going to require, talent. If they want to go tour successfully in smaller markets, then they may have to adjust their budgets and things like that. But, these markets aren't going to be saturated every single night.
Right.
A lot of them don't have venues. Somebody came to me and said, there's minor league baseball stadiums in every single small town in America.
That's interesting, isn't it?
How big is a minor league baseball stadium? 5,000 people?
Big enough for a nice outdoor show,
Outdoor being a key word in all of this too.
Exactly.
Middle America, where it's going to open up sooner than, the tight controls in other cities. And so I don't know, but Fish's point is, I think, a smart one in that, I can tell you this, it's not an easy thing finding an available venue in spring of 2022 in a major market right now.
Yeah. Wow. We have a question which is about, I don't know if you can answer this because it's about EDC Las Vegas for this year. I don't know if you're involved in producing that. But it says it's supposed to happen in May. What sort of guidelines will Insomniac follow to ensure safety, and at what point would a postponement be set in motion? I don't know.
I'm not involved with it. My understanding is that it's still currently on, and the only thing I can tell you, and I've said this a couple of times maybe, is nobody that I've ever worked with in my career cares more about his audience than Pasquale. He is not going to put his audience at danger or, at risk in any way, shape, or form. He will do everything humanly possible. He's in business to make the world a better place, and he to the extent he calls his fans, his attendees, call them the headliners. If you've ever looked at an Insomniac show, the artists are not billed based on who's biggest. They're billed alphabetically.
I love that.
When I worked for him, we used all sorts of cutting edge technology, beaker systems, the festival apps to ensure safety. We were teaching authorities on traffic monitoring. We're using our own technology when they would tell us there's no traffic, and then we'd bring them into the control center and say, oh, there is traffic actually, look here. And they'd be, how do you know that? We put beakers everywhere, and the kids would download the festival app. And, so if he's doing it, I would feel okay about it.
Yeah. Here's another interesting question from an anonymous, mysterious attendee. How do you think music in VR and gaming will continue to develop. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about getting on a Peloton playlist. So that, but I think that's a very other interesting ancillary market, the use of music and, films, VR, gaming. Where do you see the potential for that, or where do you see that business going?
Well, I mean, the biggest case studies in all of this so far have been Travis Scott on Fortnite,
Mhm.
and recently Little Nas X did a concert on Roblox, which just went public last week or 2 weeks ago. While like at a 30-40 billion dollar valuation, something crazy.
Yeah.
33 million people check this concert out. Yeah, it was free. So I think the marrying of platforms, gaming platforms, social platforms. I mean, TikTok, Fortnite, Roblox, and virtual concerts is here to stay. I think real concerts, i.e., real video, not animated video, in those platforms is here to stay.
Mhm.
And the jury's still out on virtual reality with the headgear and everything. Again, we did a lot of testing of that stuff at Insomniac. Insomniac tends to get everything first because their shows are such a big spectacle. And it's the killer app, by the way. If you could get an Insomniac show right on virtual reality, that opens up the floodgate for virtual reality, I think.
Yeah.
But the marrying of these things is here to stay. Live streaming is live streaming in a traditional sense, a band doing a concert and then streaming it. I mean, that's absolutely here to stay. Live Nation recently bought VIP, the Good Charlotte live streaming platform. And I think you'll see live streaming being bundled with regular tickets. With all this technology, you can geo-target things and geo-gate things, right? So it doesn't have to cannibalize your touring business. At the same time, if you're doing crazy numbers like millions and millions of people, I mean, the math isn't difficult to figure out.
I mean, I'm optimistic there'll be some kind of a blend because, I mean, it's what a lot of the conversation is regarding movies, for example, that, movie theaters may become, the $40 opening weekend premium experience. You're paying for the experience of being there, your experience for advanced release, right? Following weekend, there's a premium price to see it at home. And the third weekend, it's, available streaming for $10, right? But, I think any marketer would be doing a disservice to whatever they're marketing if they're not saying, okay, what are the different avenues? Because we can harness technology. I agree with you. I don't think it'll cannibalize, because I think the experience of being at a live show is so specific, right? It's why people go to live sporting events too. You want that community, that sense of being with others in the experience, right? That's why I like to go to shows. So I feel like that will never go away once we all calm down about walking around without masks.
Well, and I think as the technology continues to evolve, there's another live streaming company that I'm such a fan of called Maestro, and it's kind of a white label service. But as a band, you can go create your own screen. You can have a chat room. You can charge for a ticket. You don't have to charge for a ticket. There's a tip jar. There's a merch store. And I mean, if you really think about a lot of this stuff with the geo targeting and geo gating of it, I'll just give you an example. Let's just say you did, you could do 1 million people on one of these sites. I mean, nobody's going to do 1 million people on a white label self-serve, right? But you do 1 million people and you charge, $2 a ticket. Okay, well, that's $2 million right there. I mean, you only make $2 million.
What's the name of that service called? Maestro?
Well, the self-service one is Maestro, Maestro.
Right. That's interesting.
like the steakhouse, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's
Well,
Master.
that's Mastro's. Maestro, like a musical maestro, right? But yeah,
Um,
that's interesting though. I hadn't even heard about that. That's
but, you know,
so
also,
that's for artists that can go place themselves. It's basically like four walling your own movie. Just
yeah.
place where I can house it.
And by the way, they're in all sorts of verticals. So they're doing fashion, they're doing sports, they're doing a lot of different things. They're building a platform instead of a destination.
I'm going to have to look at that. That's going to be.
But you know, one thing, imagine in this world, you know, merchandise for artists is a huge piece of the pie. So when you're touring internationally, you have to deal with shipping, you have to deal with taxes, the tariffs. Like, it's really challenging, and you have to manage inventory. You do this stuff. One, there's micro payments, so you're selling virtual goods that cost zero, right? I mean, you can go sell your T-shirt to your avatar and make 100% margin on that, right? And by the way, that's a huge business.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You can dress up your avatar. You could show up in your Corvette in your avatar with your mullet and your AC/DC shirt, Beavis and Butthead style.
That
right?
what you're driving, a Corvette? Is that a?
No. I'm not. My wife won't let me. Talk about work-life balance. But imagine your ability to, one, have flash sales, limited item right now, boom, and manage your inventory. You know exactly what you sold. Print it and ship it.
Really interesting. Yeah.
It's so efficient.
It's controlled. It's like a restaurant having a set menu because they know exactly then what to buy. They have no waste. If you only are producing what you know has been ordered, then you're controlling your inventory costs. Yeah, very smart. All right, let me just check if we have any other questions. Well, here's a music business versus Spain, Europe, and versus US. I think we talked about this in consumer taste becoming any more global due to streaming. So let me go back to my questions. I think that's all the ones we have from the audience. I guess my last question for you, because we are just about out of time too, is you know, what would be your best advice for people who want to do what you do, who are interested in working in live events? And you know, I mean, I'm kind of seduced. I'm too old and it's too late for me to change careers, but I'm kind of seduced just because of all the travel, right? I totally see the allure of that, of being, you know, thrust into having to create, you know, the excitement of having to create something in different venues and different locales and learning the customs and seeing different parts of the world. So how do our listeners break in like you did?
Well, I mean, I think, yes, all that is very alluring, but you got to start locally and you got to start somewhere, right? So, I mean, what I would tell people is do something. I would say maybe 2 or 3 things. Like, do something. Like, either be an artist and go play in your coffee shop. Go find that artist in your coffee shop and become their manager. Go find that manager that works in your town and go intern for them. Do something. It's not going to come to you. You have to go out there, and that's never changed. That's never changed. From, you know, pre-internet, pre-social media. That's always been the case. Like, you got to go out and hustle. Build your network. This is something that, you know, has also never changed. Find your people. By that I mean people that you like, people that you trust, people that you respect. There are, and this is true in most industries that I know of, certainly in entertainment, certainly in music, there's pledge classes. You're going to find people your age, your generation, like within, you know, that, and you come up together. And so if you can learn from each other, if you can help each other along the way, I think what you'll find, and this is counterintuitive, generally speaking, people are good people in the entertainment business. There's plenty of slime out there.
That's counterintuitive. Do you just mean like the stereotypes? Is that it's all
I think we have bad rap.
twirling, cigar smoking assholes, where in fact, I mean, yeah, okay, that's all you need.
I just think we have a bad rap as, you know, like, oh, it's you know, it's such a dirty, and it's actually quite a righteous place. You know, it's like anywhere else. There's some bad people in it, but you know, find your people, work hard. I do think, while not necessary, an education is helpful. And it could be a street education.
No. As an educator, it's important. Remember your audience here, John.
And listen, one thing that I think
Both are important: street education and education.
another thing that I'd say that is hard for harder for people my age and older is being really good at social media is very important. There's just no two ways about that, and that's not going to change. And that's something that I know a lot of people, myself, have included, has been something that it's like, oh God, really, we have to go down this path, but you do.
Yes.
And for young folks, it's not a problem because my kids don't know any other way.
Right.
I do think that there was a lot of humanity that's gone away with the advent of social media, but that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation. Humanity, civility. We're going to have you come back, John, I think, because clearly we have other things to talk about. But I want to thank you so much for being so gracious with your time and so candid with your answers. I know that our audience got a lot out of it. I did. I learned stuff today, which always makes me happy, keeps me sparky to learn some new things. So thank you for that. And good luck to your daughter with all of her applications. Having gotten four kids, 2 kids and 2 stepkids into college, I'm right there with you with your heart in your throat. I know how terrifying and awful it is. So I send you the best vibes on that. And thank you again for joining us. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you, and thank you for your thoughtful questions.
All right, thank you. Bye.